Steven Furtick sat in his study late at night, surrounded by sermon notes and a half-empty mug of coffee, when his assistant entered with an envelope unlike the usual church invitations. The handwriting was bold, the seal unfamiliar, and when he opened it, the name at the bottom stopped him cold: Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso. The letter was not a political request, nor was it a mere courtesy. It was personal. Traoré wrote that he had watched sermons from Elevation Church online, but he believed that Western Christianity had lost touch with something essential. He asked Furtick to come, not to speak at a rally or attend a conference, but to sit down face to face and hear what faith looked like in his land. It was the strangest request Furtick had ever received. At first, he dismissed it. After all, what did a preacher from North Carolina have to do with a revolutionary leader in Africa? But the more he tried to set it aside, the more the words in that letter echoed inside him. You preach about faith, but have you seen faith that survives without comfort? The weeks that followed were filled with hesitation. Some of his staff advised against going, citing security risks. Others wondered if it would be misunderstood as a political gesture. But deep in his spirit, something nudged him to accept. He had always preached that God could speak through unexpected voices. Perhaps this was one of those moments. With a mixture of nervousness and anticipation, he finally sent his reply: he would come. When the plane touched down in Ouagadougou, the humid air and unfamiliar skyline immediately told him he was far from Charlotte. The airport was simple, the streets alive with the energy of people moving quickly, markets overflowing with goods, motorcycles weaving between cars. Traoré's men greeted him not with formality but with a quiet respect, escorting him through the city until they reached a modest government building. Furtick expected a polished office, perhaps military banners or displays of power. Instead, he was led into a room where Traoré sat in plain clothes, no uniform, no medals, just a young man with sharp eyes and a steady voice. "You came," Traoré said, standing to greet him. "Most would not." Furtick smiled awkwardly. "I wasn't sure I would, either. But your letter stayed with me." Traoré studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Then let us not waste time with pleasantries. Tomorrow I will take you somewhere. I want you to see for yourself what I cannot explain in words." The next morning, instead of a government convoy to a capital landmark, Traoré led him in a jeep out of the city, driving for hours into the countryside. The paved roads gave way to dirt paths, the noise of the city replaced by silence broken only by the hum of insects and the chatter of distant children. They arrived in a small village where mud brick homes stood in a circle, smoke rising from simple cooking fires. The people came out to greet their leader, but not with stiff salutes, rather with warmth, laughter, and gratitude. Children ran barefoot, women carried water, men worked under the sun, and yet there was a sense of peace that unsettled Furtick. "Here," Traoré said, motioning for him to follow. They entered a small open-air structure, little more than wooden beams and a thatched roof. Inside, a group of villagers knelt on the ground, praying aloud with voices that shook the air. Their words were in a language Furtick did not understand, but the passion in them was undeniable. Their eyes were closed tight, their bodies swayed, and some lifted their hands as though reaching for something beyond the visible. Furtick whispered, "Are they praying for something specific?" "Yes," Traoré said softly. "For protection from the militants who sometimes raid these villages. For food to last through the dry season. For their children to survive sickness. They pray because every day is fragile. But notice, do you hear fear in their prayers? No, what you hear is trust. Trust that does not depend on whether tomorrow is safe." The words sank deep into Furtick's heart. He had preached about trust in God countless times, but here it was raw, unpolished, and desperate. These were not people praying for blessings to expand their businesses or opportunities to increase their comfort. They were praying for survival, and yet their voices carried joy. He felt a lump rise in his throat. After the gathering, an elderly man approached and, through a translator, told them his story. His son had been killed in an attack months earlier, yet he said he had forgiven the attackers because Christ himself had forgiven from the cross. Furtick listened, shaken, realizing how little he had truly understood about forgiveness that costs everything. That evening, as they sat outside under the dim glow of lanterns, Traoré finally spoke at length. "Pastor Furtick, I watch your sermons. They inspire. But I worry. Christianity in the West has become comfortable. People see faith as a path to prosperity, to ease, to feeling good. But here, faith is the only weapon against despair. It is not a decoration. It is the difference between waking up tomorrow or giving up tonight. Do you understand? Furtick shifted uncomfortably. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that his message was about encouragement, about lifting people up. But something in Traoré's eyes made him pause. This was not criticism meant to wound, it was truth meant to awaken. And for the first time in a long while, he felt less like a preacher with answers and more like a student confronted with questions he could not ignore. That night, as he lay on a simple cot in the guest house provided for him, he replayed everything he had seen and heard. The passionate prayers, the faces of the children, the unwavering hope in the midst of fear. He thought of his church back home, the lights, the music, the sermons crafted to inspire. He wondered if, in chasing relevance and motivation, he had overlooked the raw essence of faith that did not need polish to shine. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was filled with images of villagers praying under the stars, their voices rising like flames in the dark. When dawn came, Furtick knew his journey had only begun. Traoré had not invited him here for polite conversations. He had brought him into a confrontation between two versions of faith, one shaped by abundance, the other forged in fire. And deep down, he sensed that his reasoning about Christianity was about to change forever. The sun rose slowly over the village, painting the clay huts with gold, and the sounds of life returned, children laughing, animals stirring, women preparing food. Steven Furtick walked outside and found Ibrahim Traoré already awake, speaking quietly with a few elders. When Traoré noticed him, he broke away and handed him a simple piece of flatbread. "Eat," he said, "we will walk today." There was no convoy, no speeches, just the two of them with a few locals guiding the way along narrow paths that led deeper into the countryside. As they walked, Traoré began to speak. "You saw their prayers yesterday. Do you know why they burn with such fire?" He didn't wait for an answer. Because they know faith is not a decoration. Faith is a lifeline. In the West, you ask God to bless your plans. Here, we ask Him to keep us alive another day. Which prayer do you think is closer to the heart of the gospel? Furtick listened, his mind spinning. He wanted to argue that God cared about both, that the small concerns of a person in Charlotte were not less important than the survival struggles here. Yet he couldn't shake the intensity he had witnessed in the villagers' worship. He remembered the old man's testimony of forgiveness. That was not prosperity, that was a cross carried daily. They stopped at another village, smaller than the first. This one bore scars, walls burned, homes abandoned, a church reduced to rubble. Children played in the dust beside collapsed beams. A young woman approached, her baby tied to her back, and began to tell her story through the translator. Her husband had been taken by armed men months earlier. She had no idea if he lived or died. Yet she said she still sang praises at night so her child would grow up hearing words of hope instead of despair. Furtick swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to weep, but the woman's steady gaze forbade pity. She did not want to be pitied. She wanted her faith to be understood. Traoré looked at him and said, "This is what I mean. We suffer, yet we do not let suffering steal our belief. That is Christianity, not the absence of pain but the presence of courage." That night they sat under the open sky again, and their conversation turned into debate. Furtick spoke carefully, yet firmly. "I believe in hope, in encouragement. People need to be reminded that God is with them in their battles, that He wants to bless them. I can't preach despair. Blessing." Traoré's voice was calm, but it cut deep. "Is blessing only wealth, success, comfort? If that is so, then my people are cursed. But they are not. I tell you, they are richer in faith than many who have everything. The blessing of God is not gold or safety. It is endurance. It is peace in the storm. It is forgiveness when revenge is easier." Furtick felt his pulse quicken. But doesn't God also want His children to flourish, to thrive, to live abundantly? Traoré leaned closer, his eyes fierce. "Yes, but abundance is not the same as excess. Abundance is having enough to share. Abundance is joy that survives when your house is burned down. What you call abundance has become indulgence. Do you see the difference?" The word stung. Furtick sat in silence, staring at the fire between them. He thought of his congregation back home, the way they celebrated victories, breakthroughs, promotions. He thought of the sermons he had preached about stepping into God's favor. None of it was false, but was it the whole truth? Was it possible he had painted only half the picture, leaving out the part that made faith resilient? Traoré softened after a moment. "I do not say your preaching is wrong. But it is incomplete. You see faith as a seed planted in fertile soil. I see faith as a flame kept alive in the wind. Both are true, but the flame teaches you how to survive when the soil is dry. The conversation lingered in Furtick's heart long after the fire had burned low. He lay awake that night, troubled, replaying their words. He realized he had always measured the strength of faith by how it thrived in abundance, never by how it endured in lack. He began to wonder if his people back home could survive if tested the way these villagers were. Would their faith stand when stripped of music, lights, and safety? Would they still worship with nothing left but breath? The next day Traoré took him to a small gathering deep in the bush. There, men and women met secretly because militants had threatened to kill anyone who openly professed Christ. They gathered quietly, voices hushed, yet the moment they began to sing, the sound rose with unstoppable power. It wasn't the polished sound of a worship band, it was raw, trembling, sometimes off-key, but filled with something Furtick hadn't felt in years: urgency. These people sang as though it was their last chance to lift praise on earth. Their eyes glistened with tears not of sorrow, but of holy fire. Furtick closed his eyes, overwhelmed. He thought of Elevation Church, of the dazzling stages and booming sound systems, the carefully timed lights, the seamless music. He wondered if, without all that, the heart of worship would remain. Here, stripped of everything, worship still burned. It didn't need polish, it needed only hunger. After the gathering, as they walked back, Furtick finally spoke. "You're right, I've preached a faith that encourages, but maybe not a faith that endures. My people need both. They need to know that suffering is not a sign of God's absence. They need to learn that real blessing is not measured by things, but by strength that doesn't break." Traoré nodded. "That is why I asked you to come. I do not want the West to lose sight of the cross." The cross was not comfort. It was not convenience. It was sacrifice. If you remove the cross, you remove the power of Christianity. Furtick felt the words like a weight pressing against his chest. He thought of how often he had emphasized resurrection power but perhaps rushed past crucifixion pain. The victory meant little without the cost. The abundance meant little without the endurance. That evening, as stars spread like jewels across the sky, the two men sat again in silence. Finally, Traoré spoke quietly, almost as if to himself. "Christianity is not a shield from suffering. It is the strength to endure it. If your people learn that, they will never be shaken, no matter what comes." Furtick said nothing. He only nodded, his heart burning. He knew these words would follow him home, altering his voice, reshaping his sermons, and perhaps changing forever the way he understood the faith he had preached for so long. For the first time, he felt he had come not to teach, but to be taught. And in that humility, something inside him began to shift. The night was quiet except for the hum of insects and the distant barking of dogs. Steven Furtick sat outside, staring at the fire that had nearly burned to embers. The conversation with Traoré still echoed inside him. For years he had preached strength, victory, breakthrough, but here, in this land where life was fragile and faith cost everything, he saw the cross in a way that unsettled him. He was no longer the confident preacher with polished words, he was a listener, a student, humbled by voices that prayed with fire though the world gave them little reason to hope. Traoré joined him, holding 2 small cups of strong, bitter tea. He handed one to Furtick without speaking. For a long while, they sat in silence, sipping, watching the night sky scatter itself with stars. Then Traoré spoke quietly, almost like a confession. "Do you know why I wanted you here? Not because I needed you to teach us, but because I believe the West is in danger. Not from guns or armies, but from comfort. Comfort can be more dangerous than violence. Violence forces faith to grow teeth. Comfort makes it soft. If Christianity forgets how to suffer, it forgets Christ." The words pierced Furtick. He thought of his congregation, thousands of people coming every Sunday, eager for encouragement, for a word to lift their spirits, for a vision of abundance. He knew they were sincere, hungry for God. But he also knew how often he had avoided the harder truths, fearing they would weigh people down instead of lifting them up. Tonight, under the African sky, he realized those truths were not weights, they were anchors. He asked softly, "Do you ever fear it will break them?" "All this suffering," Traoré shook his head, "it doesn't break them, it makes them. I have seen widows sing louder than choirs. I have seen children pray with more fire than men twice their age. Suffering does not destroy faith, it refines it. What breaks faith is when people believe God is only with them when life is easy. When suffering comes, they think God has abandoned them. But those who know suffering from the beginning never let go of Him, because they never expected ease to be proof of His presence. Furtick lowered his head, letting the truth settle over him. For the first time, he saw clearly that his message needed to change, not to abandon encouragement, but to give it roots deep enough to survive storms. A tree that only grows upward will fall. It needs roots that grow downward into the soil of suffering. That night, as he lay down, he prayed in a way he hadn't in years. No crafted words, no polished flow, just raw honesty. God, teach me, strip away what is shallow in me. Show me how to carry the cross, not just the crown. The prayer felt both heavy and freeing, as though he was finally releasing something he didn't even know he had been carrying. The following morning, Traoré invited him to speak to a small group of believers who had gathered under a tree. They wanted to hear from the pastor from America, the man they had watched on shaky internet connections when electricity allowed. Furtick felt nervous. What could he possibly say to them that they didn't already live? What could a man from comfort tell people whose lives were a daily act of courage? When he stood before them, he put aside the polished style he was known for. He spoke slowly, with trembling honesty. I came here thinking I might bring encouragement to you. But the truth is, you have encouraged me. I thought I understood faith. But seeing you, hearing you, I realize I have much to learn. Where I come from, we celebrate God's blessings in abundance. Here, you celebrate His presence in suffering. Both are true, but I think you know something deeper. You remind me of the cross. And I promise you, I will take your fire back with me. Your faith will speak in my church, in my country, maybe even to the whole world. As the translator finished, the people responded not with applause but with songs. Their voices rose, filling the air with joy. Some clapped, some lifted their hands, some wept. Furtick stood still, letting the sound wash over him like a baptism. He knew this was not the end of a trip, it was the beginning of a transformation. Later, as they prepared to leave, Traoré walked with him to the jeep. You will return to America, he said, and your world will tempt you to forget this. Do not forget, speak what you saw here. Not everyone will listen, some will resist, but some will be awakened. Furtick nodded. I won't forget, I can't. When he finally boarded the plane back to the United States, his heart felt heavier yet clearer. He had come expecting to give, but he was leaving having received more than he could measure. He spent the long flight writing notes, not for a sermon, but for himself, reminders of what he had seen, what he had felt, what he must never lose. Back in Charlotte, the first Sunday he stepped onto the stage, the church erupted in its usual excitement. Lights shone, music swelled, thousands leaned forward to hear. But something in him had changed. He looked out at the crowd and saw them differently, not as an audience to be inspired but as souls who needed roots deep enough to endure. He put aside the sermon he had prepared and spoke from what burned inside him. Family, I want to tell you about a place I just visited. A place where believers pray under the threat of death, where children worship with no instruments, no stage, no safety, but with fire that shakes the ground. I went to teach, but I came back taught. And I need to tell you something. Christianity is not proven in how high you rise when life is easy. It is proven in how you stand when everything is falling apart. True blessing is not comfort. True blessing is courage, and if your faith depends only on things going well, then it is weak. But if your faith can survive the fire, then nothing can take it from you. The room grew quiet, the usual cheers replaced by a heavy stillness. People leaned in, listening with intensity. Some wiped tears, others nodded slowly. They felt the shift in his voice, the weight in his words. It was no longer just a message to uplift, it was a call to deepen. In the weeks that followed, the change spread. Furtick's sermons carried a new edge of honesty, a rawness that both unsettled and inspired. He spoke less about easy victories and more about endurance, less about prosperity and more about perseverance. Stories from Burkina Faso wove into his messages, igniting conversations among his congregation. Some wrestled with it, others embraced it, but all could tell something had changed in him. Months later, as he stood again under the lights, he remembered the words Traoré had spoken under the African stars. Christianity is not a shield from suffering. It is the strength to endure it, and he knew that message, born from the fire of another land, would shape him for the rest of his life. Ibrahim Traoré's words had done more than challenge him, they had transformed him. And through him, they began to transform others, reminding the world that the cross was not a symbol of ease but of endurance, not of luxury but of love, not of comfort but of courage. And in that rediscovery, Steven Furtick found a faith deeper, stronger, and truer than he had ever known before.